Human beings essentially run on autopilot. When you are in the state of consciousness, and I know myself going through this Kundalini Awakening and being in this state, as I'm speaking to you right now, there is not a single thought inside my head. There is not an impulse for me to have a thought inside my head, other than the fact that my phone is ringing right now and it's distracting a little bit. But what's going on is that when there's no thoughts, it's the ego that produces these thoughts, first of all. When there's no ego, there's no thoughts. When there's no thoughts, there's an influx of the collective whole and the collective thoughts coming from this collective consciousness of which we are all part. That means that there's absolutely no difference between me and you. There's no difference between me and that grass over there or the tree over here. Essentially, everything is just consciousness. But see, the way that the human mind thinks is it thinks in terms of space and time, because that's all we see. So you're thinking, well, how does this tree have consciousness? If I have consciousness, my consciousness is inside my head. So you're thinking time and space. Maybe this consciousness is somewhere inside the head. It's a little speck of thing. But you have to try to get yourself to think outside of the box and outside of that whole frame of what is consciousness and how it works. And one thing which I noticed very clearly with this Kundalini Awakening is that my experience of this reality is vastly different than it was before. And one thing which has happened over time, thank you, one thing which has happened over time, loves that. One thing which has happened over time is that this mind's eye has awakened. Okay, I hear you. This mind's eye has awakened.
Consciousness trying to communicate with you.
Okay, I know. You see, we're communicating. I'm talking about this thing, and animals, they resonate. They understand. But anyways, what I'm trying to say is that one thing which has developed over time is this awareness of my outside frame of myself, as if I am simultaneously looking at myself from outside myself, from a third point perspective, as if there's a camera on me, and I can actually feel my facial features, I can feel myself move, my movements, and I have control over them, very conscious control, and I know what I'm projecting into the outside world. Now, the higher that this feeling of love is inside me, the more inspired I am to produce wondrous things towards other people, which people immediately resonate with and people understand and accept and want to be a part of. It's as if when you're channeling this love, even if you say, doesn't matter what you say, when there's that wavelength of energy, that love, people attach themselves to it. And that's because this is the finest and basest substance inside human beings, and is essentially what this universe is built on.
So why does it last only for a short amount of time?
Within human beings or with...
Yeah, this moment of bliss.
Because, why? Because in order for one to experience the moment, one has to get lost in time. In other words, when you're doing something creative and something that you're in rapture with, you start feeling this love. And you're like, I want to be a part of it. Your higher self just wants to come closer and closer to it. Next thing you know, you've experienced the moment for 5 minutes. You've experienced love with a loved one, a romantic one, you've experienced romance, or you've experienced love towards your friends or your family or things, which has enraptured you. And next thing you know, you're like, wow, I just experienced this thing for 5 minutes. And what happens then? You come back down to the level of the ego. And then you start thinking, okay, what next? And that's the whole purpose, right? Is that any way you want to look at it, this love is limited because there's this fine line between spirit and matter, and the ego is somewhere along this fine line. If the ego is further away from matter towards spirit, the ego loses itself in itself. In other words, the channels inside the body, the chakras, open up and they start functioning simultaneously and at the same time, and you become as if a tree. In other words, you're grounded into the earth, but you're an antenna, and you can hear things, you hear sounds, and you experience them in your heart chakra, and you experience oneness with the universe. And when you're in that state, there's no desire for anything more than that state, because the state is perfect. There's no thinking about what's next. There's essentially no thought. And so what's going on is that the purpose of all this stuff going on around us right now is for each and every one of us as human beings to evolve and come to this point where we become that way. You know, when a person's mind is thinking of like where they're at and what they're doing, they're thinking of like, oh, what did they do that day? Oh, okay, what are their plans for later? And there's all these different excitements about like, oh, okay, so now I'm doing this, but 2 hours from now I'm going to be doing this thing. Oh, I can't wait. So there's this like drive, excitement, which gets you from one moment to the next for you to come to do this thing 2 hours from now. And this is the way that the ego operates. You know, it's always thinking of like, oh, who am I? What am I doing? What did I do today? Who are my friends? Who's my girlfriend? You know, who's my family? Like, what do I own? What would I like to own? There's all these like desires and all these different things. So it's impossible for a human being to experience the now if they're constantly locked inside their head thinking these thoughts. And the ego works in such a way that once you perpetuated it and you started this chain of events and these types of thoughts, it's impossible for people to break out of them and say, okay, I would like to experience 1 minute of not thinking about anything. Good luck. Well, if you've been doing that for like a number of years, which most of us have, everybody has, unless you're a monk or, you know, an enlightened person, then your ego will operate in that way. So
why do you think the ego is bad, and why do you think a person should stop thinking?
The ego is not necessarily bad. I mean, the ego was a necessary development of man and woman that served to teach us different things at the beginning. I mean, like, there's like my theories of what the ego is and what the purpose of all this stuff is, like all this stuff going around us.
What are those theories? Tell me.
Well, my theory is that this whole world, this whole universe, well, the solar system as far as we're concerned on this planet, our solar system, the whole purpose is to teach man how to love. And so there's all these different things that were created, one of them being the ego, which serve as a roadblock, you know. And essentially every experience that we have with one another is a test of how much love are we projecting towards that person, and is there unity between ourselves and the outside world as we're interacting with it. And so over time, through childhood, this ego, this thing develops, which basically blocks ourselves from the outside world and creates a separation, right? So that you're thinking that you are an individual entity experiencing this world through the five senses, who has all these different desires, all these needs and wants and all these things, and that your purpose is essentially to compete with the rest of the people who are also attempting to do the same thing. This is what society is built on, essentially. But what's going on is that is just an illusion. It's an illusion that was created by this ego, which every single human being shares. And if, you know, so many people experience the same thing and agree on it, then that will be the truth. But there is an underlying truth underneath all of that, which is that this world is completely self-sufficient, and ourselves as human beings are completely self-sufficient interacting with this world. In other words, when you have a constant influx of love, and when it's completely encompassing your being, there's no need for the ego, there's no need for the separation. Every moment is a joyous moment, which creates a unity between yourself and the world with which you're interacting with, and the people outside in that world. And so there's this continuous exchange of love, this energy, which is essentially what the purpose of this whole planet is, for us to learn how to do that on an overall collective level. Now, where we are right now as human beings, we're very much low at the bottom end of the spectrum, deeply rooted in the material world and into our own desires, wants, and things like that. And the whole concept of love becomes very dwindled, and people are misunderstanding what the purpose of all this stuff is. And instead of spending their time on furthering themselves spiritually, which will create this influx of love for them to experience this world for what it really is, people are wasting their time spending money and earning money to spend on all these things which conceptually their ego is telling them will make them happier, but in fact they won't. They will actually just become more attached to these things, these belongings, these possessions.